The cold wind swept through the forest by the lake, carrying flurries of snow that blanketed the world in silence. On the edge of the frozen lake stood a small wooden house, its warm yellow light flickering faintly against the thick darkness of the night. Inside, Sophia stood motionless by the fireplace, her hands stretched toward the flames for warmth, though her thoughts wandered far beyond the room. Tightening her thick sweater around her, she stared absent-mindedly out the window, where the impenetrable black sky and heavy snowfall obscured the world outside. The road leading out of the house had long vanished beneath layers of snow and ice. Sophia sighed softly, the sound swallowed by the crackle of the firewood. Patrick, her husband, wouldn't be making it home tonight, a reality she had grown accustomed to, though it still left her feeling hollow. The quiet of the room was interrupted by hesitant footsteps echoing behind her. Turning, her gaze met Ethan's. The young man lingered just beyond the shadows, his gray hoodie draped loosely over his shoulders. His pale face and distant eyes carried the weight of unspoken thoughts. "Why are you still awake?" Sophia asked gently, her voice barely above a whisper, attempting to maintain some semblance of normalcy between them. Ethan shrugged and stepped forward, his sneakers leaving damp traces of an error occurred during generation. "Please try again or contact support if it continues." Barely audible, Ethan turned and retreated up the stairs to his room, leaving Sophia alone. She stood frozen, her mind a whirlwind of unanswered questions. Outside, the snowstorm roared with unrelenting fury, as if forewarning the challenges yet to come. Sophia sat quietly in the living room, her gaze fixed on the steady flames dancing in the fireplace. Ethan's words from earlier echoed in her mind, haunting her like a melancholy tune. He had spoken of his mother, of Patrick, and of a deep emptiness that she could feel in his voice. But what unsettled her most was the look in his eyes, a gaze filled with pain and something deeper, something she couldn't quite name. Reaching for her cup of tea, she found it had gone cold, much like her attempt to find solace in its aroma. Her thoughts wandered back to when she first joined this family. Patrick, her husband, had once been a man of charm and power. They had met at an art exhibition, Sophia an ambitious young artist, Patrick the event's primary sponsor. He had seemed to embody everything she thought she needed: stability, success, and a love that felt like a shield against life's insecurities. But once she moved into his home, she realized that this perception was an illusion. Patrick had always maintained an emotional distance, a barrier reinforced by secrets from a past he refused to share. He loved her in his way, but his love was never enough to fill the growing void inside her. And then there was Ethan. He had entered her life like a quiet shadow cast across the household. From their first meeting, Sophia had felt unsettled. Ethan was distant, his beauty cold and detached. His eyes, though mature beyond his years, carried a deep, unreachable pain. The introduction had been as indifferent as Patrick's tone. "This is Ethan, my son. He lost his mother not long ago, but he's fine now," Patrick had said, his words cutting like an icy blade. Sophia had forced an awkward smile to mask her discomfort, but the truth was painfully clear. Ethan was not fine. Trying to be a good stepmother, Sophia had struggled against Ethan's quiet resistance. He didn't resent her, nor did he seek her out. He simply existed, detached, behind walls she didn't know how to break. At first, she attributed it to teenage rebellion and the anguish of losing his mother. But as time passed, she realized it was Ethan's way of shielding himself from the world's cruelty. 2 years slipped by, and Ethan grew taller, but his wounds remained unhealed. He became increasingly withdrawn, avoiding Patrick and spending most of his time in his room. Patrick, as always, was oblivious. "He's growing up. He'll figure it out," Patrick had said dismissively when Sophia expressed concern. "You should focus on yourself and stop worrying so much." But worry she did. Sophia couldn't ignore Ethan's isolation. It mirrored her own, a loneliness that gnawed at her from within, born from the hollowness of her marriage. Patrick's life revolved around his work, and when he was home, he was more absent than present. His fleeting moments of attention were never enough to bridge the chasm between them. Sophia's heart ached not only for herself, but also for Ethan, both of them bound by silences that spoke louder than words. Sophia often forgot what it felt like to share a meal with her husband. Every time Patrick left for another business trip, their house became a vacuum of silence, broken only by her swirling thoughts and Ethan's quiet footsteps upstairs. Lately, though, something about Ethan had shifted. It wasn't glaringly obvious, but subtle. His lingering glances, faint smiles loaded with an unspoken weight. Whenever their paths crossed in the kitchen or the garden, words weren't exchanged, yet the tension between them was as palpable as the winter chill outside. A week ago, the picture came into sharper focus. It was the night Patrick left for yet another 2-week trip. That evening, Sophia found Ethan sitting on the back steps of the house, staring at the frozen lake. He seemed almost spectral against the snowy landscape, his shoulders trembling against the relentless wind. Wrapping herself in a coat, she stepped outside with a cup of steaming cocoa. "Ethan, aren't you cold?" she'd asked quietly, lowering herself beside him and holding out the cup. Ethan accepted it, but didn't drink, offering only a faint, hollow smile. "Sometimes the cold makes me feel more real," he said, his voice almost blending with the wind. "At least it doesn't lie. It doesn't pretend to be anything it's not." Sophia hesitated, unsure how to respond. She understood the sentiment far too well, but what struck her was how vulnerable Ethan allowed himself to be. When he looked at her, his gaze seemed to strip away every fortified wall she had built around herself. It was then she realized Ethan wasn't the only one searching for solace. That memory lingered as she sat alone in the living room now, the firelight flickering across her face. Outside, the wind howled, carrying with it a sense of inevitability that made her uneasy. Sophia knew she needed to maintain boundaries, to draw a line where none had been tread before. But Ethan's gaze, his words, those thoughts pulled at her heart, drawing her toward an edge she wasn't sure she could avoid. That night, as the snowstorm raged outside, Sophia huddled in her armchair near the fireplace, wrapped in a wool blanket. Midnight had come and gone, but sleep eluded her. The wind against the window sounded like a mournful wail, pulling her into a fog of restless thoughts. It felt as if she were waiting for something she couldn't name. The soft creak of footsteps on the staircase broke her reverie. She looked up, and the firelight lit Ethan's face as he came into view. His gray sweater and sweatpants hung loosely on him, his disheveled appearance at odds with someone who had just woken up. Yet it was his eyes that caught Sophia's attention. Heavy with turmoil, they betrayed hours of sleeplessness, weighed down by thoughts too burdensome to bear. "Couldn't sleep either?" Ethan asked softly, his voice cutting through the storm's howl. Sophia often forgot what it felt like to share a meal with her husband. Every time Patrick left for another business trip, their house became a vacuum of silence, broken only by her swirling thoughts and Ethan's quiet footsteps upstairs. Lately, though, something about Ethan had shifted. It wasn't glaringly obvious, but subtle. His lingering glances, faint smiles loaded with an unspoken weight. Whenever their paths crossed in the kitchen or the garden, words weren't exchanged, yet the tension between them was as palpable as the winter chill outside. A week ago, the picture came into sharper focus. It was the night Patrick left for yet another 2-week trip. That evening, Sophia found Ethan sitting on the back steps of the house, staring at the frozen lake. He seemed almost spectral against the snowy landscape, his shoulders trembling against the relentless wind. Wrapping herself in a coat, she stepped outside with a cup of steaming cocoa. "Ethan, aren't you cold?" she'd asked quietly, lowering herself beside him and holding out the cup. Ethan accepted it, but didn't drink, offering only a faint, hollow smile. "Sometimes the cold makes me feel more real," he said, his voice almost blending with the wind. "At least it doesn't lie. It doesn't pretend to be anything it's not." Sophia hesitated, unsure how to respond. She understood the sentiment far too well, but what struck her was how vulnerable Ethan allowed himself to be. When he looked at her, his gaze seemed to strip away every fortified wall she had built around herself. It was then she realized Ethan wasn't the only one searching for solace. That memory lingered as she sat alone in the living room now, the firelight flickering across her face. Outside, the wind howled, carrying with it a sense of inevitability that made her uneasy. Sophia knew she needed to maintain boundaries, to draw a line where none had been tread before. But Ethan's gaze, his words, those thoughts pulled at her heart, drawing her toward an edge she wasn't sure she could avoid. That night, as the snowstorm raged outside, Sophia huddled in her armchair near the fireplace, wrapped in a wool blanket. Midnight had come and gone, but sleep eluded her. The wind against the window sounded like a mournful wail, pulling her into a fog of restless thoughts. It felt as if she were waiting for something she couldn't name. The soft creak of footsteps on the staircase broke her reverie. She looked up, and the firelight lit Ethan's face as he came into view. His gray sweater and sweatpants hung loosely on him, his disheveled appearance at odds with someone who had just woken up. Yet it was his eyes that caught Sophia's attention. Heavy with turmoil, they betrayed hours of sleeplessness, weighed down by thoughts too burdensome to bear. "Couldn't sleep either?" Ethan asked softly, his voice cutting through the storm's howl. Sophia had crossed a line she had promised herself she would never approach. Now, guilt and longing battled within her, leaving her feeling like a stranger to herself. The creak of footsteps descending the wooden stairs pulled her out of her thoughts. Ethan appeared, still in his pajamas, his hair tousled. The hesitance that usually clouded his eyes seemed absent now. He looked at her, his lips parting slightly as if he was about to speak. But Sophia couldn't bring herself to meet his gaze. "Not yet, not now." "Good morning," he said softly, his voice as steady as it had been the night before. Sophia gave a small nod, her voice carefully composed. "Good morning. Are you hungry? I could make you something to eat," Ethan offered, stepping closer and pausing just a few feet away. His voice carried a cautious warmth. But then he hesitated. "Are you okay? I don't want things to feel weird between us." Sophia finally looked up, meeting his earnest gaze. But before she could say anything, a sharp knock at the door broke the fragile silence. Both of them froze, turning toward the sound. Sophia's heart sank. She already knew who it was. Amber. The charming yet sharp woman strode inside, brushing snow from her coat. "This storm is no joke. Roads are completely blocked. Thought I'd crash here for a bit here." Amber's bright smile shone, but her observant eyes immediately darted between Sophia and Ethan. Her sharp gaze lingered, cutting through the tension in the air like a blade. Sophia forced an awkward smile. "Of course. Lucky you made it here safely." Amber removed her scarf and coat, her calculating eyes roaming the room. "Lucky her," she said slowly, her tone shifting. Then, with a knowing edge, she added, "Feels like I've walked into something." The words hit like a slap, and Sophia struggled to keep her composure. Amber wasn't one to miss subtle cues, and the strained breakfast that followed only thickened the tension. Hardly anyone spoke, and every silence seemed weighted. Finally, Amber pulled Sophia outside under the pretense of getting fresh air. The storm had waned, but the cold still bit sharply, much like Amber's words about to follow. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Sophia," Amber started, her voice direct and unrelenting. "What's going on here? Do you think I don't see what's happening?" Sophia shook her head, avoiding Amber's piercing gaze. "It's nothing, Amber. Ethan, he's just dealing with a lot right now. He needed someone to talk to." Amber tilted her head, one eyebrow arching in clear disbelief as she stepped closer. "Don't lie to me. You've never been good at it. I saw the way he looked at you this morning, and the way you've been avoiding him. This isn't just talking." Sophia's hands clenched into fists, her emotions threatening to spill over. "Amber, it's not." But her words trailed off. It all felt like it was coming undone. Amber's voice sharpened, her eyes narrowing. "You're talking about Patrick's son, your husband's son. This isn't just complicated, Sophia. It's a ticking time bomb. If Patrick finds out..." Amber paused, her gaze locking on Sophia's panicked expression. "Wait," she said, her tone dropping. "Patrick doesn't know, does he?" Sophia shook her head, her voice trembling. "He doesn't know, and you don't understand. Patrick isn't innocent in all this, Amber." Amber frowned, confusion flickering in her eyes. "What are you saying?" Sophia drew a shaky breath, finally surrendering to the truth she'd worked so hard to hide. "Patrick's been cheating on me for the past 2 years. I don't know who she is, but I've seen the messages. All those nights he said he was working late, he wasn't. I've tried, Amber. I really have. But I can't do this anymore." Amber stood silently, piecing together Sophia's words. Then, as if the realization clicked, she spoke softly. "So, you felt alone, betrayed," she said, her expression now a mix of judgment and sympathy. "And then, Ethan, you found comfort in him." Sophia's tears spilled over as she nodded. "I know it's wrong, Amber, but I can't stop how I feel." Crossing her arms, Amber stepped back, her face unreadable. "Sophia, I can't make this decision for you, but you need to understand something. If you keep going, you won't just lose Patrick. You'll lose Ethan. You'll lose yourself." Sophia didn't respond. She just stared out at the snow-covered lake, everything slipping through her fingers. Inside the house, Ethan stood silently at the window, watching them. His expression was hard to read, but his posture tensed as though he knew the weight of the conversation happening outside. The pale morning light dimly filtered through the snow-covered window panes. Sophia sat at the dining table, a cold mug of coffee in her hands. She turned it absently, her mind replaying the memories of last night as if stuck in an endless loop. It wasn't just a dream anymore, or a line she'd been tempted to walk. She and Ethan had crossed that forbidden boundary, and now guilt wrestled with longing, leaving her feeling like a stranger to herself. The soft creak of footsteps on the wooden stairs snapped her back to reality. Ethan appeared, wearing his sleepwear, his hair messy and tousled. His eyes no longer held hesitation, but instead carried something resolute. He looked at her, lips parting as though to speak, but Sophia quickly looked away, unable to meet his gaze. "Good morning," he said softly, his voice as gentle as it had been the night before. Sophia nodded, her tone carefully steady. "Good morning. Are you hungry? I can make something for you." Ethan studied her for a moment, as though weighing words he could not yet speak, and between them, the unspoken truths of what had passed and what lay ahead hung heavy in the air. Sophia took a hesitant step forward, stopping just short of him. "Are you okay?" Ethan asked gently, his voice full of concern. I don't want things to feel strange between us," she whispered, meeting his earnest gaze. Before she could continue, a sharp knock at the door broke the charged silence. Both froze, their heads snapping toward the sound. Sophia's stomach dropped as realization hit. She already knew who it was. Amber, poised and confident, swept in, shaking snow from her coat. "What a storm," she declared brightly, her voice carrying effortlessly. "Roads are blocked, but I figured I could crash here for a bit. That's okay, right?" Her smile was wide, but her sharp gaze darted between Sophia and Ethan, catching the tension hanging thick in the air. Sophia forced a strained smile. "Of course. You're lucky to have made it here safely." Amber unwound her scarf, shrugging off her coat as her observant eyes lingered on them. "Lucky, yeah," she replied slowly, the edge in her voice unmistakable. "But it feels like I've interrupted something." Her words cut through the room like a blade. Sophia kept her composure, but Amber wasn't someone who could be easily fooled. Breakfast the next morning passed in stifling silence. Forks scraped against plates as no one dared to speak beyond what was necessary. Afterward, Amber cornered Sophia outside under the guise of getting fresh air. The storm had quieted, but the biting chill of the air mirrored Amber's tone. "What's going on here, Sophia?" Amber asked, her voice blunt and devoid of pretense. Sophia avoided Amber's piercing gaze, her voice faltering. "It's nothing. Ethan, he's just going through something. He needs someone to talk to." Amber arched a skeptical eyebrow, stepping closer. Sophia, you've never been a good liar, especially not with me. I saw the way he looked at you this morning, and the way you've been avoiding him. This isn't just about talking. Sophia clasped her hands tightly, the weight of everything threatening to pull her under. Amber, it's more complicated than you think. Amber's eyes narrowed, her tone sharpening. Complicated? You're talking about Patrick's son, your husband's son. This isn't just complicated, Sophia. This is a disaster waiting to happen. If Patrick finds out, she stopped abruptly, studying the anxious expression on Sophia's face. Wait, Patrick doesn't know, does he? Sophia's head bowed, her voice trembling. He doesn't know, but you don't understand. Patrick isn't innocent in this, Amber. Amber frowned, suspicion flashing in her expression. What are you saying? Sophia took a shaky breath, the truth she'd buried for so long spilling out. Patrick's been cheating. For 2 years. I don't know who she is, but I've seen the messages. The nights he said he was working late, but he wasn't there. Amber, I've tried so hard, but I just can't take it anymore. For a long moment, Amber said nothing, her mind visibly piecing everything together. So, you felt betrayed, alone, and then Ethan, you found comfort in him. Tears welled in Sophia's eyes as she nodded. I know it's wrong, Amber, but I can't stop how I feel. Amber stepped back, crossing her arms. Her expression was an uneasy mix of judgment and empathy. Sophia, I can't make this decision for you, but you need to understand, if this continues, you're not just going to lose Patrick. You'll lose Ethan. And most importantly, you'll lose yourself. Sophia stood silent, Amber's words crashing down on her like the weight of the snowstorm that had finally lifted. Amber turned and headed back inside, leaving Sophia outside in the brittle cold. Sophia's gaze drifted to the frozen lake, her hands balled into fists as the icy air stunned her skin. Inside, Ethan stood by the window, his eyes locked on Sophia and Amber's retreating figure. He didn't need to hear their conversation to know it was shaping all their futures. With her breath misting in the frigid air, Sophia felt the hollowness of the moment settle in her chest. She stood there, unmoving, as the suffocating silence wrapped around her. The weight of Amber's words echoed relentlessly in her mind. If she kept going down this path, she would lose everything. But if she turned back, would it mean returning to the lifeless existence she'd been so desperate to escape? Her breath dissolved into the wind as she turned slowly, her decision still veiled in uncertainty. Sophia stood outside the house, the warm glow of the firelight spilling from the large windows. Inside, Ethan stood, his gaze meeting hers. It wasn't accusatory, nor did it carry the longing of the night before. It was patient, quietly painful, the look of someone unable to make the decision themselves. Sophia exhaled deeply and stepped back inside. The heat from the fire wrapped around her skin, but it couldn't chase away the chill in her heart. Ethan watched her approach, his lips parting slightly, but she raised a hand to stop him. "We need to talk," she said, her voice strained. Ethan nodded, his eyes reflecting an unbearable sadness. "I know what you're going to say," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper, "but I don't want to hear it." "Ethan, listen to me," Sophia said as she sat in the chair opposite him, her hands clasped tightly on her knees. "You're special. You've made me feel things I haven't felt in years, but we can't keep doing this. It will hurt both of us." Ethan remained silent, his shoulders trembling as though holding back something heavy. "I don't want to lose you," he finally said, his voice breaking. "You're the only one who understands me, the only one who really cares. And I'll always be here for you," Sophia interrupted, her eyes brimming with tears. "But not like this. You deserve more than this, Ethan. I can't be the one to give it to you." His eyes glistened with unshed tears as he looked at her. "But who else could? My father. He doesn't even see me." Sophia's heart etched at his words, but she remained resolute. She stood and placed a comforting hand on his shoulder, her hesitations gone. "You'll find someone, Ethan. Someone who can love you the way you deserve. But that person isn't me." Ethan stared at her, searching her eyes for a different answer. When he found none, He nodded slightly. I understand, he said, his voice cracking. But that doesn't make it any easier. Sophia didn't respond. She knew there were no words to ease the pain. She simply stood still as Ethan turned and walked away, each step heavy as though carrying the weight of the world. The door to his room clicked shut, and Sophia felt as though a part of herself had closed forever. Later that night, she sat alone by the dying firelight. Amber came in with 2 mugs of tea, setting one in front of her without a word. They sat together in silence, a silence Sophia finally welcomed. The next morning, as the snowstorm cleared, Sophia stepped outside to look at the house one last time. Ethan was awake early, packing his things to return to school. Their eyes met briefly, but neither spoke. Both understood that this was goodbye, not just in distance, but in their hearts. Patrick returned that afternoon, his face bright with a smile, and his usual stories about work. Sophia stood by the dining table, watching the man she had once thought she loved, feeling only a profound distance from him. Amber had been right. Staying with Patrick meant keeping the family intact. But Sophia knew she could no longer live a lie. That night, after Patrick had fallen asleep, Sophia took out a pen and paper. The words flowed effortlessly, as though they had waited years to escape. She left the note on the kitchen table, picked up a small suitcase, and stepped outside. The biting icy wind stunned her skin, but she barely noticed it. She climbed into her car, started the engine, and looked back at the house one final time through the rearview mirror. It was time to start again, not for anyone else, but for herself. As the house disappeared into the distance, fading into the dark, Sophia felt a sense of lightness she hadn't experienced in years. For the first time, she could breathe, free from the invisible chains of her own life. Whatever lay ahead, she knew one thing for certain: she wouldn't run from it anymore.